Nick, let's start with what the safeguard mechanism actually is, besides having a very terribly boring name. What does the name actually mean?
It's an awesomely boring name, which the policy's inherited from its predecessor. So back in 2013 or 14, I think, the Abbott government had planned, it had abandoned previous climate mechanisms, and it had decided that it would use taxpayers' money in what it called direct action to pay industrial emitters to emit less. And the safeguard mechanism, or a version of it, was designed then to make sure that they didn't just pocket the money and keep emitting. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we've got a new version of it now. And I'll try and be simple, but in the simplest terms, it's a mechanism to drive down pollution from the heaviest industrial emitters. It's not a general catch-all for all of
It's not
Australia's
economy-wide. It's just the 215 worst industrial polluters.
They've looked at, okay, which facilities are emitting more than 100,000 tonnes a year, and how can we get them to drive down their emissions? So they've got, who's emitting more than 100,000 tonnes? It's 215 facilities, and collectively they're emitting about 143 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions a year. So what they've said is, okay, that's going to be the cap. The amount collectively that you're emitting this year, we're going to cap it at that.
Yeah.
And anything that you go over collectively, you're going to have to pay for. And the way they're doing that is they've looked at each facility and they've given them a baseline. And those that come in under their baseline, or those that meet their baseline, don't have to pay any money. Those that come in under, well, let's go to those who go over first. Those that go over then have to pay for credits.
Yep.
Or they have to pay per tonne for those emissions, to offset those emissions that they go over.
Yep.
Those that come in under can sell their credits.
Sounds suspiciously like a carbon credit trading scheme to me.
I wouldn't say that, but some people have said that it sounds a bit like a carbon trading scheme. But really, its design is meant to give a financial incentive for these organisations to save money by not buying offsets, by instead using that money to buy new clean tech. Mm-hmm. And should that happen, as designed, it should come, our emissions or emissions from those facilities should come down by 93 million tonnes by the year 2030.
Thank you for that succinct explanation. It's my view that the citizens of Australia should not be forced to completely understand every new climate policy the government comes up with, because they seem to chop and change their minds so often, all the governments. David, I want to go to you now to talk about the politics of it. The Greens were originally opposed to the safeguard mechanism as it stood. What changed and what concessions did Labor make to the Greens to change their mind?
The main concession was a hard cap. So as Nick said, there's a measurable outcome by 2030 in terms of reducing emissions, I think to 100 million tonnes by 2030. So that's a hard level, and the Greens' demand is that level be reached. The Minister, Chris Bowen, will have to make sure that outcome is achieved. And I think the Greens justifiably are pointing to this as something that they've achieved in the negotiations, and I think that's significant. I know that there's a huge debate about whether this is a worthwhile scheme, whether this scheme goes far enough when you compare it with the comments around the world, especially from the United Nations, about what needs to be done. Then safeguard mechanism doesn't go far enough. It doesn't achieve all of those things that the scientists are demanding around the world and the United Nations Secretary-General is calling for. But I think in the historical perspective, when you look at the politics, I regard it as a huge deal. I just do, and that's because I've written about every attempt to get an outcome in Parliament since, in fact, before the carbon pollution reduction scheme in 2009, where there was a total rift in Parliament over whether to do that or not. I saw that happen and fail. I saw a carbon price legislated after the 2010 election, and then I saw it repealed. I saw direct action dreamt up by Tony Abbott and his ministry, and then a huge debate about, the sheer cost of that in achieving change. Then I saw the coalition attempt the clean energy target. I think the debate on that only lasted for a month before the Conservatives within the coalition shot it down. Then there was the National Energy Guarantee, and that failed as well because of the Conservative bloc within the coalition. So for all the scepticism about the safeguard mechanism and the complexity, what's actually happening is the first significant legislated action on climate change since 2010. It's not a small deal. I know a lot of voters will probably shrug their shoulders and say, thanks, we'll bank that, it's good to know it's happening. And I get that because people just want to know the government gets on with stuff. But it is significant. Jury's out on whether it'll do enough, but I think once the mechanism's in place, there is now going to be the next debate, which is, well, how can we improve it?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a lesson in two things, really. We've set the bar so incredibly low, it was quite easy to surpass in one sense. But as you say, something is better than nothing, and I think that's probably the view of most voters.
Actually, can I interrupt? Sorry,
yeah.
Jack. I was walking into Parliament this morning, and outside there were always protesters there. There's some of the most dedicated climate protesters that you'll see because they're in front of Parliament House every morning from 6:30. And I said, what do you reckon? And some of them said, it's better than nothing. So the phrase you just used, I think that is, that's a judgment that many will make. Better to have it than have the failures we've had in the past.
Well, we'll be able to tell soon enough as well whether or not it's working. I just want to ask about the Greens' demand or request, forceful request for a total ban on the development of new oil and gas projects. That's what they wanted in exchange for their support for this deal, but they didn't get it. Tell us what they sort of might have gotten instead, Nick.
Well, as David's just said, the main thing was that hard cap. The great concern from many critics of this legislation before that concession was that wealthy facilities, wealthy businesses would be able to simply buy offsets rather than drive down their emissions. When you have a hard cap, that becomes harder to impossible. So that mechanism is meant to make these real cuts rather than simply offsets. But there were other things as well. They managed to extract a concession that new gas facilities, gas export facilities, when they come in, they start at a baseline of net zero rather than 100,000 tonnes.
Mm-hmm.
And they also got concessions about or compromises about how this policy will be updated over the years to come. And I think that that's a really significant thing in this policy. In a way, it mimics what's been achieved through the Paris Accord. The Paris Accord has totally failed to get us where we need to be on reducing emissions. But it has set up a mechanism whereby you extract a gain, you bank it, and then you force the parties to come back
to
and
the
set
table.
the next target.
Yep.
And that can exist within this legislation.
Okay. There are, I think, 116 proposed coal and gas projects that are registered with the government at the moment that may or may not proceed. And the Greens leader, Adam Bandt, is claiming that due to the Greens' sort of reforms to this policy, the cap will mean that only half of those 116 proposed new projects will go ahead. Nick, is that true? Where does he derive that figure from?
Well, what he's done is the Greens have looked at an Australia Institute analysis of those 116 proposed projects.
So this is just projects that companies have said, hey, we want to do this, and they've registered it with the government, but may or may not go ahead anyway.
This is the point. A lot of these would fall by the wayside as a matter of course. But because of the new strictures here and the new costs that have been introduced, it is likely that many more of them, or several more of them, many more of them, will fall by the wayside. What they've done is they've looked at, they've calculated if all of those 116 went ahead, how many million tonnes of carbon would they emit? And it's about 250 million. Under the hard cap of 143, there's just not that budget anymore that they could legally emit. So by some means, via this legislation, those projects will either fall by the wayside or they'll have to find a way to make them cleaner.
I mean, internationally, we know all the climate scientists and the IPCC are saying basically we've got to stop extracting coal and gas.
Yep.
And the government doesn't want to put that ban on, but it seems like they're sort of doing it a little bit through the back door in that they're making it a lot harder for those new projects to go ahead.
Yeah, the IPCC has the International Monetary Fund, I'm getting my acronyms mixed up, has said if we're to meet Paris goals, there is no scope for new fossil fuel infrastructure and projects. This government doesn't have a mandate to simply ban an industry.
Yeah.
However, what it is doing is knocking out financial supports that had existed through various means for that industry.
Yeah.
And making it harder for these new projects to go ahead. Now, you won't hear anyone from Labor, I think, saying that outright, but that's the effect.
Okay. So, I mean, this does all come back to our commitments under the Paris Agreement, which I think is to limit warming to 2 degrees by 2050?
By the end of the century.
By the end of the century. And we've got net zero by 2050, which is supposed to get us there.
That's meant to put us on the glide path to stabilising the climate at less than 2 degrees warming or as close to 1.5 as possible.
So will the safeguard mechanism get us there?
Absolutely not. As David's just said, it doesn't get us anywhere near there. To be fair to the government, though, this is, as I said at the outset, this is just a policy to tackle the heaviest emitters in industry. It doesn't look at transport. It doesn't look at housing. It doesn't look at how much emissions come from agriculture, from our buildings. So the government is going to have to come up with a lot more tough-up policy in a whole range of areas to put us in a position to meet the targets so that we're doing our contribution to meeting Paris Agreement targets.
David, I just want to go to you about the politics of this. There was obviously a lot of controversy within the Greens and not just within the parliamentary party, but within its supporter base over whether or not they should be purists or pragmatists over this policy, to back it or not. Was it a mistake for the Greens to have supported the safeguard mechanism? Do you think they'll pay a political price or will they get a dividend from it?
It's hard to know the ultimate political price because that'll be defined at the next election. But I think it was really important for the Greens to set their own direction now as a party room where all but one of the current Greens party room were not in Parliament when the 2009 vote was held on the CPRS. So although iconic former leaders like Bob Brown and Christine Milne said, don't agree to the safeguard mechanism, the current party room under Adam Bandt decided on that pragmatic course of action to get something done rather than nothing. And I think that's because the current party room has got a pragmatic leader in Adam Bandt. And let's face it, at the last election, they did pretty well. You look at where they are in the lower house now. There used to be just Adam Bandt alone in the lower house. Now he's got 3 colleagues. So they're gaining ground with his approach and they're setting their own direction as a new generation, basically. And that puts them up with several fights against Labor at the next election, not just on asking for a halt to all new coal and gas, but also things like housing policy, where they're holding out against this $10 billion housing fund and saying it's just not enough to satisfy the demands of renters and people who can't afford to get into the housing market. So they're not putting all of their focus on climate policy. They've got other fights with Anthony Albanese as well, and I think that's really important for the party. I don't see, I think they've still got a lot of ground in which to take the fight up to Labor on climate. So for all the discussion about 116 coal and gas projects, I think on the gas front it really comes down to 3. Narrabri in northern New South Wales, Barossa in the far north, Northern Territory, and the Scarborough gas field in WA. And I think a lot of it's going to be about Narrabri because we know the new state government in New South Wales believes it'll go ahead because it's already ticked off on approvals. Federal Labor thinks it'll go ahead. But there are still barriers to that project, and I think there's still a fight over whether that proceeds. So, there's a lot of scope for competing on climate between Labor and the Greens. The fact that they've both voted for the safeguard mechanism doesn't mean, there are no further signs of friction on climate, that's for sure.
Which is probably a good thing for both parties in a political sense. I want to turn now from the state of the Greens and, their uneasy arrangement with Labor to the state of the Liberal Party, which is really suffering right now after the New South Wales election at last weekend. So now Australia is almost entirely held by Labor following that result. Tasmania is the one exception. David, what is going on here? Is this coincidence or is there a larger pattern at play?
There's certainly a larger pattern. There's a sense that the coalition is losing the mainstream. Labor's gaining ground in the middle of the political spectrum, and there's really no greater evidence of that than the not just the New South Wales election. I'm really thinking of the increase in support for Anthony Albanese and federal Labor since the election in the opinion polls. And this is not just our Resolve Political Monitor, it's across the board in the polls. There's stronger support for Labor than there was federally last May, and that's because they've come in with a very smooth transition. They haven't rocked the boat. It's true that from many commentators, they haven't gone far enough. They're not revolutionary enough. They're not shaking things up enough. But the whole point, from Anthony Albanese's point of view, was to have a smooth transition. I mean, look how he handled the death of Queen Elizabeth. You know, no outbreak of republicanism, handled it very steadily. And that's worked. And I think part of that worked in New South Wales as well. Looking at Canberra, New South Wales voters could see that there was a way for Labor to take power without causing a total revolution. And Chris Minns basically took a bit of the Albanese approach in promising a smooth transition. Some people say that it was too light on in terms of his policy platform, but it clearly worked. And I think in action, if not in words, he adopted that message from Albanese about conflict fatigue in the community. He was aware of conflict fatigue and he adjusted his strategy accordingly, and it worked.
It was a remarkably civil election. And in fact, I think some people on the Liberal side are saying that it was too civil, that they should have gone stronger in their attacks on Chris Minns and their sort of scare campaigns thereof. Nick, our colleague Nikki Sava, the columnist, wrote this week that the Nationals have created or left such a poisonous atmosphere within the coalition that the New South Wales Liberals are now even discussing splitting from the Nationals in opposition because of the brand damage, I suppose, they think that the Nationals have inflicted on them. What do you make of that, particularly around climate policy? I mean, it does seem like there's so much that the Liberals could have done if they hadn't had the Nationals weighing them down, particularly at a federal level where the Nats were really, really against the Morrison government, for example, sticking to or legislating a net zero by 2040 target.
Yeah, the Nats constantly advocated against setting targets which the rest of the community had already
gotten on
considered
board with.
and decided that they wanted. And federally, and in New South Wales, Matt Keane has proved very adept from a coalition standpoint in introducing energy and climate policy, which has been broadly accepted. In New South Wales, obviously, we have an energy system and up and down the East Coast dependent on ageing coal-fired power stations, which have to be replaced. So, he developed a policy whereby they would be replaced largely by renewables and supported by gas. And that worked as an energy policy, but also as a climate policy. And the Nats, both the federal and state level, have been really resistant to that. And he finally, in New South Wales anyway, was able to get their very grudging support at times by conceding in environment areas. So land regulation, the way the government controls land use.
Koalas, the poor koalas of New South Wales have been the victims.
Well, yeah, we joke, but quite seriously, the Nats threatened to blow up the last coalition government over the protection of koalas, which has since gone on the endangered list in this state. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary.
Because of the land clearing policies that the Nats particularly pushed.
The National Party takes a really hard line on that. And that has been a point of consternation for the Liberals, and it opened them up to attack from Labor. It's been put to me a couple of times covering this area that a Liberal Party Environment Minister in New South Wales can only be as effective as the National Party will let them be. Yeah. And I think that's been a great frustration.
David Crowe, we saw the Teal candidates at the last federal election. One of their main attack lines against the Liberals were, if you vote for Scott Morrison, you get Barnaby Joyce. I mean, that was one of their biggest attack lines. Would we ever see a splitting or a sort of a distancing at the federal level between the two coalition partners?
I think it's possible. In opposition, it's easier for the Liberals and the Nationals to run separate campaigns. It's more difficult in government when you've got the unity of cabinet convention. So I think that we'll see more of that in opposition. We saw that with The Voice. The Nationals came out totally against The Voice, even though there's division in their own ranks on that, before the Liberals took a final position. In fact, we're still waiting to see the final outcome from all of that. But we are seeing the two parties taking different stances at different times. But I don't see that as being much of a solution because I think the Liberals are themselves so divided between Conservatives and moderates, and they haven't figured that out. And it's not just economic policy, it's not just climate policy. We see it in Victoria at the moment with the questions over Moira Deeming and the way she went to a rally when neo-Nazis turned up. Do you condemn that straight away? Well, she was very slow to act on that. Now there's been an outcome. However, the divisions run deep, and they're on social issues, they're on trans issues, they're on culture wars. It's not the old days of wets and dries having a disagreement over privatisation or economic policy. And so it's much harder for them to fix and to come to some sort of settlement about where they stand as a party. And I think that's going to be extremely difficult for the Liberals, extremely difficult for them in winning back the Teal seats. In a sense, the question over how they work with the Nationals, well, actually, I think that's actually easier than the question about how they work with themselves, because it's an internal party rift that's very hard to solve, and it'll last, I think, not just for this term, but for the next.
I want to just switch quickly to the Aston by-election, which is coming up this weekend. Of course, Aston is the inner Melbourne seat that's been vacated by Alan Tudge. So it's a brave man who makes any predictions about elections, but we're going to make you or ask you respectfully to make one anyway, David. Do you have any predictions about what will happen at Aston?
I predict that the Liberals will hold Aston. The reason I make that prediction is that history is on their side. You do not see swings to governments at by-elections that often. They're rarities. The Liberals think they have a pretty good candidate in Rashina Campbell, so they're hopeful. I covered the 2018 by-elections where there was a big sense that there'd be some gains by the government, but again we saw history proven right, and it didn't work out that way for Malcolm Turnbull in the middle of 2018. So despite all the conjecture that you see and all the hopes on either side, history tends to be a pretty good guide. I do think that there will be a question over Peter Dutton in the wake of the Aston by-election unless there's a really strong swing to the Liberals. Anything less than a strong swing back, because Alan Tudge was the candidate at the last election, does raise questions over Peter Dutton. The big problem they have is if Peter Dutton is not the answer for them, who is? The alternative candidates are people like Susan Lee as Deputy Liberal Leader and Angus Taylor as Shadow Treasurer. Either of those don't have as much baggage as Peter Dutton has in the community because of his long record as Cabinet Minister. Fairly divisive figure, I would think it would be fair to say. But that's a big call for the Liberal Party to go to a new leader after the by-election. It all depends on the result.
I think it's sitting on a 2.5 margin now after Alan Tudge lost a lot of ground at the last election. So it will be interesting to watch if you're into that kind of thing. I think that's all the ground that we need to cover today, gentlemen. I really appreciate you coming in and explaining what can be quite a dry area of policy. Let's hope that we at least stick with the safeguard mechanism for a while, because it might give us a bit of time to get our heads around it before they switch it again.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.